When Soviet forces crossed into Afghanistan in December 1979, they moved swiftly, eliminating the existing communist leadership and placing Moscow loyalist Babrak Karmal in power. Yet, turning military occupation into political stability would prove far more difficult, as Islamist rebel fighters known as the Mujahideen already controlled vast stretches of the Afghan countryside. Karmal publicly promised democratic freedoms and respect for Islam, and offered pardons to former political enemies to shore up his base. Behind the scenes, however, the ruling PDPA established the brutal KAD secret police, operating in close coordination with the Soviet KGB. Public outrage spread quickly. On February 21, 1980, roughly 300,000 Kabul residents took to the streets. Soviet and Afghan forces responded with lethal force, killing as many as 700 demonstrators. In Moscow, senior officials were divided. While some favored a quick withdrawal, General Secretary Brezhnev and KGB Chief Andropov pushed to keep troops deployed. The 40th Army's roughly 80,000 soldiers were tasked with protecting over 20,000 kilometers of roads, stretching forces thin across more than 800 isolated outposts. The problem was structural. Red Army officers had been trained for conventional warfare in Europe, not guerrilla counterinsurgency. Most troops were inexperienced conscripts, and even capable special forces units were too few in number. Senior commanders found themselves scrambling to learn from historical examples of partisan warfare, often without success. The Soviets' first major offensive, in the Kunar Valley, set the tone for years of frustration. Intelligence failures led paratroopers to land directly on enemy positions, while an armored column walked into an ambush. Soviet soldier Yuri Tinkov recalled insurgents targeting exposed limbs and heads, knowing troops wore body armor. After bringing in better trained reserves and helicopter gunships, the Soviets eventually cleared the valley at a high cost, yet the Mujahideen simply returned once government forces withdrew. The rebels themselves were far from a unified force. More than 30 Mujahideen factions operated out of Pakistan, with the so-called Peshawar 7 holding the most influence. All were Sunni Muslim and predominantly Pashtun-led, ranging from radical Islamists including Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's Hezb-e Islami, to more moderate factions. Iran meanwhile backed 8 separate Shia groups. Despite their internal divisions, all shared opposition to the Soviet presence and a vision of an independent Islamic state, even if they disagreed on what that meant in practice. Pakistan's military ruler Zia-ul-Haq saw the invasion as a strategic opening. He envisioned a compliant Afghanistan as the foundation for a wider Islamic regional bloc and a way to end his own diplomatic isolation. Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, funneled support to radical factions like Hekmatyar's, using them as instruments of Pakistani foreign policy. The country quickly became the central hub for international aid flowing to the resistance. External backing came from multiple directions. The United States, viewing Soviet expansion through a Cold War lens, provided financial support and small arms. China, wary of Soviet power, sent weapons. Saudi Arabia, threatened by Shia Iran's regional ambitions, matched CIA contributions dollar for dollar. Britain's MI6 also became active in the conflict, with controllers quietly searching for future leaders among the resistance fighters. One figure who received British support was Ahmad Shah Massoud, a Tajik commander of the Jamiat-e-Islami group based in the Panjshir Valley. Massoud organized a broad-based resistance that went beyond simple ambushes, mobilizing civilians alongside fighters and distributing roles across the population. His valley sat dangerously close to the strategic Salang Pass, and 3 separate Soviet offensives in 1980 failed to dislodge him. In many ways, the 40th Army's decision to focus resources on urban centers left areas like Panjshir in insurgent hands, a choice some analysts would later describe as a critical missed opportunity. As the war dragged into 1981, the Soviet military began to unravel from within. Inadequate shelter, food, sanitation, and medical care triggered outbreaks of hepatitis, typhoid, malaria, cholera, and dysentery. Hospital wards designed for 30 patients held hundreds. Morale crumbled. Veterans returned home bitter and disillusioned, some having lost faith in the Soviet system entirely. The transport aircraft carrying zinc-lined coffins home, referred to as Cargo 200, became a grim national symbol. Meanwhile, the war in the shadows intensified. Mujahideen fighters assassinated government officials, while Soviet and KAD agents infiltrated rebel networks and conducted brutal interrogations. By the start of 1982, the DRA government controlled only 5,000 of Afghanistan's 35,000 villages. That year brought an unprecedented escalation centered on Panjshir, where Massoud's growing reputation had drawn Western media attention and increased foreign backing. The Soviets assembled a massive combined force of 12,000 troops, hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft to root him out. Massoud had organized his roughly 4,000 fighters into mobile strike groups and defensive units, and while Soviet firepower eventually forced a fighting retreat, his forces escaped intact, and Soviet outposts left behind quickly became easy targets. Subsequent operations in the valley yielded no lasting results. Soviet frustration bred brutality. In the village of Podgwabishana, troops channeled flammable chemicals into irrigation canals where civilians were hiding, killing over 100 people. Medical access was deliberately restricted to drive rural populations toward government-controlled cities. Western aid organizations attempting to operate field hospitals found their facilities specifically targeted and destroyed by helicopter attacks. The rebels adapted as well, growing more sophisticated and better equipped. In late 1982, they struck Kabul's power grid, plunging the capital into darkness. Their arsenal expanded from rifles to RPGs, mortars, and recoilless rifles, much of it purchased by the CIA directly from Chinese factories. Brezhnev died in November 1982. His successor Andropov, already gravely ill, proclaimed publicly that the USSR would not retreat from Afghanistan. Yet Soviet intelligence quietly negotiated a ceasefire with Massoud, infuriating Karmal. Massoud used the pause strategically, attacking a rival faction and securing his own supply routes. Under Reagan, American involvement accelerated sharply. CIA funding climbed from $15 million in 1981 to over $200 million by early 1984. Congressman Charlie Wilson and CIA officer Gus Avrakotos coordinated outside official channels to keep weapons flowing while maintaining plausible deniability during the Iran-Contra period. Pakistan's Zia secured a $3.2 billion military and economic aid package and retained control over how assistance reached the various Mujahideen factions. Andropov's death in February 1984 brought Konstantin Chernenko to power. Seeking to project strength, Chernenko authorized harsher measures, including civilian executions, notably the killing of 250 villagers in Kunduz in December 1984. These tactics only deepened anti-government sentiment. By year's end, roughly 3.5 million Afghans had fled to Pakistan, and another 1.5 million to Iran. The refugee camps imposed their own hardships, particularly on women from urban professional backgrounds, who now found themselves confined by conservative Pashtun social norms. The 40th Army did undergo meaningful tactical reforms during this period. Drawing on lessons pushed by former Chief of Staff Ogarkov, commanders emphasized small unit operations, combined arms coordination, and specialized training. Anti-sniper teams, flamethrowers, and mine-clearing tanks became standard tools. Night raids and village assault drills were practiced in detail. Yet helicopters remained perpetually scarce, and friction with Afghan army units continued to undermine operations. Mikhail Gorbachev replaced Chernenko in March 1985 and immediately signaled that the war needed to end. He bluntly told Karmal that Soviet troops could not remain forever, while simultaneously authorizing one last military surge. Special forces targeted supply routes from Pakistan, and major offensives were launched across eastern Afghanistan. The underground Mujahideen base at Zawar, containing a mosque, hotel, weapons depots, a medical facility, and a radio center, successfully held out after 7 weeks of fighting, becoming a symbol of rebel resilience and a showcase for foreign visitors. After 6 years and thousands of dead on both sides, the situation remained deadlocked. The 40th Army had become significantly more capable at counterinsurgency, but the Mujahideen were better funded and armed than ever. Government political reforms had failed to win over the population. Historian William Maley captured the dynamic well. The Soviet-Afghan War was not defined by a single turning-point battle, but by a relentless accumulation of inconclusive engagements that gradually wore down the will of Soviet leadership. Gorbachev, focused on domestic restructuring, wanted an honorable exit. Finding one would take several more years and cost tens of thousands more lives.